food, bad processed food, but at least they're trying to get people calories at the basic level.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. Very cool. All right, you guys. It looks like Talia is here. Hi, Talia.
Hi.
How are you?
Hello.
I'm fine. Can you hear me okay?
Like I said before, Talia is a reporter at the Center for Public Integrity. She's won a lot of awards for her work. I personally have seen her work through a big reporting project. I think I've seen her work through one that took maybe like 3 or 4 months. She looks at environmental justice issues. Talia's from Flint, Michigan. I'm sure you all have heard of it by now. Talia is a very talented reporter with a lot of experience. She has worked at Politico, got her law degree from Georgetown, has been, read in places like Slate, NBC News. She's been read in CNN. Talia is super talented. She's super tenacious. Does not take no for an answer. On anything. Always chases down sources, chases down data. Just all around a good person. We used to work together. So I'm gonna let Talia talk a little bit about her process and about how she goes about investigating social justice issues, and more specifically. Some of the reporting projects that she's worked on. Like Tasneem Raja from Code Switch during her session, I'm probably going to pipe in and ask questions, and you all should feel free to do that too. I am not going to talk too much, because I want her to talk about her projects, but she's done some really important and compelling work. That's changed people's lives. So let her take it away.
Thank you, John. That was so nice. So hi, everybody. I don't know how much you've done, how much you've read the stories or not that we did, but I'll give you a quick synopsis of the project we did that won some awards, and then we can just talk. And if you guys have questions about, or kind of how we approach different sensitive topics, I'm happy to kind of answer whatever works best for you guys. So we did a series called Environmental Justice Denied, and it's still on our website. It's publicintegrity.org, and you can just look up Environmental Justice Denied or me, and it'll pop up. And what we did is we looked at more than 15 years of complaints to the Environmental Protection Agency. Just to kind of step back a little bit, the Civil Rights Act, the Federal Civil Rights Act, requires that every federal agency have an Office of Civil Rights. And that means that if I, as a citizen, have some sort of concern about the way that a local agency is administering some sort of policy and saying, hey, I think I'm being discriminated against, I'm supposed to be able to go to the federal agency that gives them money and say the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality or whatever is being discriminated against me, and I want to file a complaint. And the federal agency is supposed to be able to investigate that and see whether or not there is actually any issues. So that's across everyone. That's, agriculture, that's commerce, that's, every possible agency in the federal government. So we looked at just the Environmental Protection Agency because we cover the environment here. And what we found is that over those years, there was never a formal finding of discrimination, which the fact that you can't have a formal finding of discrimination over dozens of years just seems on its face like, okay, there's something's wrong here. And what we did is so we went through, created a big database that's actually on the website still that you can search, and you can kind of parse it if you wanted to look up your state or whatever. So it's there. We collected all this data, put it into a database, and then we tried to look through and say, okay, well, what are the trends that we see? what are the types of cases that we see getting dismissed? What are the states where we see the most, or that we see the most of these complaints or whatever? And we basically mapped everything. My reporting partner, Kristen Lombardi, and I, we did this. And trying to find people who illustrated the problem with the agency. And we went through, we collected maybe 30 different complaints, just trying to, one, see if we could find somebody. Again, some of these cases had been lingering from like the late 90s. And people move, people die, things like that happen. We had to figure out, one, that these cases actually fit the problems we were seeing around the agency as a whole, but also two of these stories were reportable. We have a lot of calls just trying to find people to see what happened with the cases, to see, if people still remembered what happened. And we settled on 4 new communities. We'd already gone to one in Ohio previous to that. Sorry about that. And we'd already gone to one previous to that. And so we, Kristen and I just split those 4 up rather. And then we went and did the reporting. So I went to New Mexico and talked to like 1 million people, it felt like, over there, and just kind of really got a sense of the different cases, a sense of, kind of what they remembered about the situation, and also what it changed on the ground between when they filed the complaint and when they actually, or where we were at that point. So one of the cases had been the only preliminary finding of discrimination that the agency had ever done, and they were actually in the middle of a lawsuit. And then the other case had been pending for 13 years, I think, at that point. And so we were talking to them, and they were just also well. So anyway, so we write the story that 95% of the time, I think it is, whenever a community files a complaint to the EP Office of Civil Rights, they're rejected. And the agency makes no formal action, basically, on their case. It was interesting because we published that story in August of 2014, and it got really good reviews, from activists and from people in the environmental justice community. But it happened to coincide with the Flint case kind of blew up that winter. So like around December, January, everyone started talking more about environmental justice and kind of looking into things. And so we got this resurgence of interest from people, from the media, from different classes. I went up to Wesleyan to talk, and we also got some awards, which has been nice, or whatever as well. So that was that's like the general path of the story so far. One cool thing that's been resulted as a part of our investigation is, one, it's caused a lot more attention to be pointed at the EP Office of Civil Rights, and which is important, especially now, because they're in the process of remaking or establishing a lot of different procedures, and trying to change a couple of rules in the Federal Register, actually. So a lot more scrutiny is being paid to them as well. And then also the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was also investigating EP Office of Civil Rights during this period, and they just released their report, I think maybe 2 weeks ago. And they cited heavily our reporting as kind of the basis of a part of their report, which is huge because that report goes to the president, it goes to Congress, and it's actually something that is actionable that that lawmakers will be able to point to and to use to go forward with. So that's what we did. So I don't know what I can tell you about kind of how or what you're more interested in. So do you guys have any questions?
Talia, I have a really quick question. So you essentially, you and Kristen essentially went after, well, not went after, but you guys were like investigating a government agency, right? So how difficult was it to get documents that you needed from that government agency when you were essentially not policing them, but looking into something that they really weren't on top of their game about.
Sure. And I'm not sure how much of this is that they didn't want to be a part of, you know, of us digging into them or not. But I think it may also just be that, you know, the federal government doesn't really respond really great to FOIAs anyway. But so we filed our original FOIA in summer, I think, of 2014, shortly before I came to the center. We got our first batch of documents that like November-ish, like around then. And they said that they had completed our request by December. When I went back to go look through, because what they do is they give you like a document log and what they expect to produce to you, and then you always double check that with what you actually get to make sure that you know, you got all the documents you're supposed to have.
Okay.
And so you do that. I did that, and I found that, you know, I was missing a ton of documents. And so what we did is basically I spent the next maybe 6 months emailing them, talking to them, having conversations with them, saying, these are the documents I don't have from you. These are the documents you were supposed to provide. These are the things that are incomplete. Why are these not around? And so I would just call them a couple times a week. I would email a few times a week, and they probably got tired of me just because I didn't have anything else to do. Like, this is what I am paid to do all day. So I was like, I don't care if you don't respond. I will fill your voicemail up. I will, you know, fill your inbox up because this is what I need. And you told me you're supposed to give it to me. There was, they were fairly responsive. It just was at one point they kind of got spooked because we had started to do some reporting as well. And so we have reached out to the press office to say, hey, we want to have an interview with the director. And so as soon as we did that, like, a lot of the communication with the FOIA office like completely stopped. They were like, well, we have to bring in public relations and we have to do this. And I'm like, no, your job is FOIA. This person's job is public relations. Like, the two really don't have anything to do with one another. And regardless, this whole process was supposed to be finished in December, and we're now in May. So if you just give me my documents, we can just be done with this right now. So it was like really frustrating, and we actually still didn't get everything that we originally promised, and that was partially also because FOIA officer that we had basically said, oh, I'll just give you a handful of documents that weren't in our original request, but he had just promised that he would give them to us, and then he left the agency. The agency didn't honor what he said he was going to do, and so then it's like, oh, we have to file a new FOIA.
Did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so we had to file a new FOIA, and then it was like they literally, we filed that new FOIA, let's call it maybe June of last year. Mm-hmm. They called me a month ago to say, hey, we still have this FOIA outstanding from you. Do you still need it? And I was like, you know what, it's fine. That's great. So, I mean, and that happens. I mean, there's one of my colleagues here at the center, she did a big project that had required all the 50 states to respond to a FOIA. And I would hear her every day on the phone with someone like, look, you're not complying with the law. You're not doing this. And it was like, she would be on the phone, like, not screaming, but also just like being very, very persistent and saying, no, this is the law. This is what you're supposed to provide to me. This is what you haven't. I mean, that's really like half of our job, making sure that people give us the things that they say they're going to give us, and like bugging them about it and being okay with that.
So Talia, like, these are issues that are like important to you, like the story you did in environmental justice denied, and like these are like for the most part like social justice stories. So like, how hard is it for you to like be like a journalist and not an activist when you're like, how do you say something is like because like, you know, like the things that were happening to the people that you featured in Environmental Justice Denied, like, these were really messed up things, right? So like, how did you as a reporter like say something is trash without saying like, I think this is trash? You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, I think the best way to do that is with facts. So I mean, we didn't come in there and say, you know what, we think this. It's like, no. This is actually what the law says. This is what EPA has done. This is what this person's experience was with EPA. And it's like, if you have, especially if you have something like a rule or something like a law. So for example, EPA has implementing regulations for basically how they will implement certain federal laws. And so we just looked at the laws and said, well, these are the things you're doing. You aren't doing them. So it's not our fault that you're not doing them. And so you can't be mad at us for pointing out this fact. And so that's the thing. I mean, we also had a lot of conversations as well about the tone of the stories, about the language we're using, about fairness, and about making sure that we got EPA, that EPA was not surprised. And this was not an ambush. We talked to them several times. They knew what we were doing. We were talking to them, obviously, all throughout this process. And obviously, you don't always do that depending on how sensitive your story is. You may, bring them in a little bit later on. But they knew that we were doing this. And we said, look, we're fine. If you guys have done things to fix this, great. Tell us about it. We'll write about it. And we did include a lot of their stuff. We had maybe an hour-long interview with their director, and she explained a lot of the things that they had done to correct a lot of the problems that historically had been in the office.
Yeah.
And we included a lot of that. And so we did that, and we said, look, we're not here to just ding you. We're also going to address the fact that part of the reason you're having these problems is because you don't have a lot of funding, because you haven't had a director, because there are a lot of these other systemic issues that are going on. It's not just like, oh, the Office of Civil Rights is horrible at doing his job. It's well, there are a number of different reasons. You have 3 people that cover all of the civil rights cases in the entire country or whatever, and that's going to be an issue. So we tried to just be fair throughout that time, and we also just tried to make sure that we didn't let people levy unsubstantiated attacks at the agency. It's if you say they don't care, it's well, okay, you feel that they don't care, so explain to me why you feel that way and talk to me about that. It's not it's not just insulting the agency or whatever. It's at least give me something and give me a reason. Tell me about your experience more so than just making blanket statements. And so we did that, and then we basically, the good thing with documents is that a lot of them are dated. So it's well, if you say, I felt like I didn't care because I didn't hear from them for 10 years, and it's well, I have the date that this complaint was accepted, and I have the date that it's today, and you haven't gotten anything, well, that just kind of speaks for itself. And I mean, it's also just kind of to the activism side or whatever. I mean, journalism, not that it's activism, but we are trying to change things. That's why we report on things a lot of times, especially when you're writing on some sort of government malfunction or malfeasance or something like that. You're saying that this is not right and this should be different in some sort of way. It's not the same as a pure activism organization like a Greenpeace or Sierra Club or something like that. But we are saying that we're trying to hold you to the things that you said that you're going to do. And it's not necessarily that we're prescribing solutions like some of these other agencies, but we're saying, hey, look, these are things that you said you're going to do. Tell me why you're not doing them. And then one of the things that we did that I think is actually pretty good is we actually talked to activists and said, well, here are the problems that are in this agency. What are things that could be done, or what are some options, or just what, and we just kind of talked through solutions with them or whatever. And we put that out as well. And we said, hey, here's some of the solutions people have. These are some of the things that EPA is already doing. And, and I think that as long as you try to present that sort of fair representation of what's going on, that's really all you can do. Okay. People are going to decide whether or not you're an activist or not. I mean, as long as you're dealing in facts and not, trying to push an agenda, there's nothing else you can worry about.
Yeah. So how did you find your sources for this kind of story? Because a lot of it was a lot of it was on the ground reporting, when you went to New Mexico, when you went to these different places. I mean, because there's a difference between, right, calling a government agency and them giving you somebody or them giving you a document, but finding the actual people that were in your stories, because a lot of those people told you some pretty kind of like personal things. So like how did you like find those like people?
Yeah. So the complaints gave us a good head start. So the complaints, so anyone can file a complaint. Individual can file a complaint, but a lot of times organizations file complaints on behalf of individuals. So if it was a specific individual, sometimes those will be blacked out. Sometimes you'd look up and that name would not be blacked out, which is great. But a lot, or redacted rather. But a lot of times you had some sort of an agency or organization or community group that has filed these complaints on behalf of these citizens. And so we went through a lot of the community groups. Sometimes people, this world is a small world anyway. And so the environmental justice world, not like the world. So the environmental justice world is a small world, especially people who have complaints. So if we're talking to someone who we know is really active and has filed a lot of complaints, we'll say, hey, do you know anyone who was involved in this case in New Mexico, or, you know, the Rosemere case in New Jersey or whatever? Do you remember anything about that? Do you know anyone who did anything with that? And so we went that route. We did a lot of clip searches for the agencies, for the organizations, the agencies, the facilities, what else did we do? We did a lot of LexisNexis, just running people through. It's like, okay, we know we have this person who's around here, or, you know, we have a certain number of qualifiers that we may have picked up from the letter that they wrote, and we'll put that in. But a lot of it was just me calling like random organizations and like there were a handful of churches have filed complaints. And so I would just like, you know, call some church in Louisiana and say, hey, do you remember this complaint from 1995? It was about this, you know, facility they were building. Anybody there who might remember this thing? And they were like, yeah, this guy down the street might know. And so they would put me in contact with that guy. Yeah. And I talked to him, and sometimes they remember, sometimes they wouldn't. And we ran into a lot of dead ends that way, because there were a handful of people we just could not find. We just could not find them. We had no more information on them. We had no more, nothing else to try. And so we had to let those cases go. And then sometimes you find people, like I remember there was a case in Louisiana at the church rather, and they happened to have like one of the ministers or whoever was like in charge of like the justice component of the church, whatever. And he was like, yeah, I remember that case. I was the one who filed the complaint. I did all these things. They never built the facility, so not a big deal. And sometimes a lot of those things happened as well, where there just wasn't there wasn't anything for us to follow up on, really. And so that was it. So I mean, we went through, did a lot of, like I said, LexisNexising. We did a lot of clip searches, a lot of word of mouth, and then going through the agencies. But we used the documents we had as our first sort of source list to pull from.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. Very cool. Does anybody else have any questions? No? No? All right. I guess you answered it.
So, do you have mostly experience with governmental agencies, or do you have experience trying to deal with private organizations as well? Like trying to get information from them?
A little bit of both. So even though this story was about the Environmental Protection Agency, each of the complaints usually dealt with a very specific company or a very specific company. So for example, in the New Mexico story that I did, and that was a case where one of the complaints was pending for, I think, like 13 years or something like that. There was a very specific company that was proposing to build this facility. They never built the facility, but they still had the permit and the option to build it to this day. And so what I did is I went and I called. I went through and I called the company. I had to go through basically their permit application, which was hundreds of pages long, try to figure out who they were, what their name was, because it's not very standardized, and then try to find names for them, and then find numbers for them, and find email addresses, and find this, and find that. And so I did that. reached out to them, didn't get any response. I called, didn't get any response. So when I went to New Mexico, I drove 2 hours to their offices and popped up. And they were there. And so they were like, oh yeah, let's talk. And so I sat down with them and we talked, and I explained to them, you know, what the story was. And actually, let me run that back. They did call me back like when I got there. That's why I drove 2 hours. That's why I drove 2 hours.
So
I drove 2 hours before it. No, okay. So yeah, so they did call me the day that I got into New Mexico. And so I drove 2 hours to get to their offices. We talked, and they didn't remember much. Like the guy who had done the original permit had died, and his son was running the facility or the company, and he's like, that was my dad's thing. I don't really know anything about this, and we don't have a problem, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, but you still have this permit. You still have this option. You're actually trying to renew it. So what's the deal? And he was very friendly, but he didn't know much, and he didn't know much about the case that was actually pending. And so it was a little hard, but just being there and him explaining, you know, kind of why they chose that site and what he did remember about that, I think definitely helped me. And it also helped me to identify the exact spot on this random piece of road in New Mexico, where they were looking for this facility to be built. And so he was still valuable. And but yes, I mean, I've had some experience with things like that. I also did the same thing with Sasol in Louisiana, Mossville, Louisiana. I had to talk to them for another story that I was doing. But the same thing kind of applies, whether you're dealing with government or you're dealing with private companies. Like, yeah, there's not as much, there's obviously no FOIA power there, but there's still a lot of publicly available documents that you can use. There's a lot of different source documents that you can use to just try to either find people, find information, or to corroborate information.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Joel, did you have a question? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I had a question about maybe would be helpful to the students. I'm Joel Beeson, came in a little late. In terms of approaching officials for interviews and people in the private sector who definitely sort of, you know, are wary of the press, and especially people doing sensitive issues. What kind of approach do you take with that?
Okay, so with the government, what I'll try to do normally is try to figure out who my contact is at whatever agency I'm dealing with fairly early. And then I'll just reach out to them and say, hey, you know, can we talk really quickly? I'm doing a story. I want to, you know, I'm going to want to talk to you guys at some point, but I want to just see what information you might have, and just, you know, very conversation if I've never talked to them before. And depending on how soon I'll need to talk to them. So it may be that conversation is just like a, hey, you know, I think we're looking into this. Can you point me in the right direction of this? I'm sure you guys have this piece of information. Can I you know, just direct me to where this is on the website or whatever? It may be more like that. Or it may be, hey, sorry, I want to talk to you about it. Then I can do a formal, just make sure you understand what this story is and what we're doing here. So that when I put this request in, it's very clear. And so I'll have that conversation with them, answer any questions they might have, any concerns they might have, and also explain to them, like, no, the reason I'm doing this is because, you know, if we don't talk to you, if you guys do not make someone available, then we'll have to put that in. I'd much rather talk to you. I'd much rather be able to have you have your say in this. And so I try to explain it in that way for people in the government. And if they don't, then obviously I just say, okay, they refuse to comment. And sometimes they'll usually figure out something, and you can figure out that way. For private companies, obviously there's a little bit less outrage when a private company doesn't want to comment versus when the government doesn't want to comment, because the government obviously, you know, works for the people or whatever. But pretty much the same thing. I usually wait until closer to the time when I always wait until I figure out exactly what the story is going to be and what angle I need to go with them. So with the Gandhi Corporation, which was in New Mexico, I already had a good sense of what the story was, where the permit was, what things were, and what was happening. And I said, hey, and I reached out to them and I wrote them an email, and sometimes I'll draft several and have like a coworker look it over and say, does this make sense? You know, I'll read it a couple times and like sit on it and like, you know, just make sure that it is as succinct as possible. And my first email is usually not a general, but it's not as good as like, this is my entire story, and here we go, and what I'm talk to you about. I'm like, hey, I'm doing a story about the Triassic Park facility, and you know, I understand you're the owner of the permit, and I wanted to just talk to you about it. I'm hoping to set some time up to speak with you about this. Let me know what your availability is. And so I try that a couple of times. Hopefully then I can finally talk to someone. And because really what I am doing is I'm talking about the, actually in this case, I probably wrote something along the lines of, hey, we're doing a story about the EPA Office of Civil Rights, so that they know that we're talking about the EPA office and not them specifically. And so I say, okay, and we're writing the story about the EPA Office of Civil Rights. One of the cases we're focusing on involves your company, and we'd like to talk to you about it. And I made it clear that it is not about them, but it's about just kind of this agency overall. And yeah, those didn't work, but that's what I usually do. And usually it does work. And even if it's you just get, you know, like, hey, we're not interested in talking, or here's a response. You don't get an interview, but usually they will respond to that, because right at that point they don't know anything malicious. And if they have more questions, then I will say, hey, I'm happy to talk to you about this, like off the record, so you can understand what the story is about. I'm happy to do that usually with them. So I just try to make sure that if there's a way for me to answer their questions and somehow bring them onto my side so that I can interview them, then I try to do whatever I can to do that.
Yeah, it seems like it, you know, who you approach and how you get access to particular kinds of information is really specific to that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you always try to go through the right person. So, I mean, a lot of times when I go through a company, I'm going to hit up the press person. And if they're unresponsive, then I might try to find, like, you know, an executive's phone number or something like that. But I'm like, okay, well, this is the proper channel. I don't want it to be that, you know, they're somehow rejecting my complaint, my conversation with them because I didn't go through the right channels or whatever. So, and again, sometimes if you have, like, you know, somebody's email address and that's what you've got, then you use it. But I am probably more so like, okay, I'd rather not give you a reason to not talk to me than not. So I'm like, I'll try it your way first, and then I'll ratchet it up as necessary.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask another question. Because one of the things where we're at is, you know, I think we've talked to a lot of folks in sort of food justice agencies, food banks, and they're sort of officialdom in a sense, right? They're the agency. Mm-hmm. Do you have any sort of advice or feedback for students about, you know, getting in contact with the people who are sort of served, you know, in this case, the hungry, because we're doing it on food justice. And how would you approach that, that conversation with them? First, you know, an appointment with the director of the food bank.
So you guys are looking at not people who are homeless, but just people who are like food insecure?
Yeah. Okay.
So first, what we do is either like the agencies that you said that the organizations already work in that space. So maybe it's a food bank, maybe it's, you know, some sort of social justice group or whatever. Reach out to them and say, hey, we're actually looking for real people. We're looking not for a director. We want, can you put us in contact with, or is there a site where we can go, you know, even if they need to be kind of your guide into it, like so that people know that it's okay to talk to them, say, hey, can you to some people? Because one, they'll usually know who, they'll usually know people's situations. They'll know people who they'll know kind of, and if you tell them what they're looking for, they can usually try to kind of point you to the right people who will, I guess, not fit in your story, but who exemplify the things that you're trying to figure out. So if you're talking about food insecurity for families, they won't necessarily direct you to a single man, you know? So I do that. I usually start with them because I figure they already know people. But then also if you're, if you're talking about maybe a particular food bank closing or something like that, you can also just go show up and talk to people around there, or like go to where people would possibly congregate that are in the group you're trying to deal with, and try to talk to them. I mean, that's obviously less ideal, but that's something that I was reading, or no, I was talking to a friend of mine who works at the Washington Post, and she was telling me about how someone there was doing a story on a hotel nearby that is used as extra homeless housing when the shelters fill up. And what she did is she just staked out the hotel, and she was there. People saw her every day for hours, and like she didn't have to be in the office because she's like one of those reporters that gets to be out all day. And but she just was there for 8 hours for several days. And so she would try to talk to people, maybe try to talk to the same people a handful of times. They'd be like, oh, I don't want to talk. Come back the next day, maybe they want to talk a little bit more, and they got to know her. They got to see, okay, you know, this person's going to be here. This isn't just like I'm diving in here to exploit, you know, your situation. And she eventually was able to gain the trust of someone who not worked there, but who lived there, and who, you know, had a child, and, you know, invited her in and told her whole story. And so part of it is, you know, if you can't get those entrees in, I mean, that's the easiest way. But sometimes it just takes you being there and showing up and showing an interest and showing people that you were going to be there.
Okay, very cool. Talia, thank you so much for talking to everybody. I know you're really, really busy. I know you have a lot to do. So it looks like, I'm looking in the background. Are you at your desk?
No, I'm at, well, so we moved some people, but I'm in Elle's old office, which is now Jim's new office.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very cool.
So,
Very cool.
but yeah, but thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. Thank you, Talia.